My name is Nayaswami Jayanti, and this is Nayaswami Bhavani, and it's our great blessing and honor to lead service today. Is there anyone here for the first time today? Wonderful, you're all old friends. No new friends. And today's topic is one near and dear to my heart. Growing up in the Methodist Church, we had to memorize the Beatitudes, and they were recited frequently. I didn't quite understand exactly what they meant, but I knew that they were important because those are the words that Christ gave in the Sermon on the Mount, which was really for his disciples, not for the world at large so much. But sometimes over time, language changes and words change their nuances and they have different meanings. So in preparing for this talk today, I decided to go back to Swami Kriyananda's book, Rays of the Same Light, which is the longer version of the Rays of the One Light that we just read from, where he gives a little more in-depth explanation of what the Beatitudes mean. Otherwise, one might think, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, means blessed are the losers, and they get to go to heaven, you know. We think poor in spirit means somebody that has no fire, no energy, but it meant something entirely different when he said them in those days. And basically what he's referring to here is humility. And humility is not self-abasement, as some Christians might think, or for that matter, some others might think. It's self-forgetfulness. So it's not sitting, as Swami puts it in his writings, that's really quite sweet. Some Christians think that being humble means to be sitting and staring at somebody's knees instead of looking them in the eyes and taking every insult, like, you know, oh, hit me harder, you know. That's not what it means at all. It means to completely forget yourself, completely forget the ego altogether, which comes across as a very different understanding. In fact, the word beatitude itself, according to Webster's dictionary, means a state of utmost bliss. Well, if we realize that that is what we're aspiring to, which Yogananda said that the definition of God is ever conscious, ever new, ever existing bliss. I didn't say that in the right order. Ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. That is what we are all aspiring to. And so the attitude of humility becomes one that's extremely important. So if we understand being poor in spirit and that light, it makes a little bit more sense. In fact, Swami talks about the lives of saints and how if we look to the saints as an example of how to be, none of them were weak and spineless and, you know, sort of slinking off in so-called humility. They were strong. St. Paul, if you watch the movie Peter and Paul, if you've ever had a chance to see that movie, it was a documentary that was made for television about the apostles Peter and Paul and what their life might have been like. You know, of course it's a television production, so it might not be exactly true to the fact, but you really get the sense that St. Paul, he was a man of great fire. I mean, he came after Christ, right? He wasn't there with him, present. He wasn't converted until after Christ's resurrection. And he was traveling on the road to Damascus, actually to round up more Christians to take them back and throw them into prison. You know, these awful creatures was sort of his mindset. And on the road to Damascus, he had a divine revelation when Christ appeared to him and asked him, why do you persecute my people? And he was completely changed. And Peter was a man of great fire also, although sometimes I think perhaps he was a little bit envious of Paul's fire, because Paul was out there dealing with not the Jews, not in Israel. He was out there dealing with all of those other people in other parts of Europe that, you know, weren't necessarily of his own kind, although Paul was a Roman citizen, so he could appeal to them as a Roman citizen as well as a Jew. But he's the one that stood up for them and said, they don't have to be circumcised like you Jews, because there was an argument at the time that in order to be a Christian, then they had to be circumcised. And Paul said, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. So Paul was a man of great fire. Peter was a man of great fire. If you think of other saints that we have read about, Joan of Arc, what an incredible soul she was. She had to have had great fire. So having humility and being saintly does not mean, being weak or spineless. It means quite the opposite. It means having great courage and facing adversity. Like right now, I can't recall which, might have been St. Catherine, who held up the cross when the armies were advancing, and it were the barbarians that were going to take over her convent, and she held up the crucifix, and they were stopped in their tracks. Well, she had great faith and great courage to stand there and know that the power of God was going to stop this army of barbarians that were going to come and overtake her convent. And they literally stopped in their tracks. So it takes incredible courage and great fire, if you will. St. Teresa of Avila was another one who had just incredible fire. Padre Pio, if you've ever read the story of his life, and it's extremely inspiring. He fought with Satan, I think, his whole life. Satan appeared to him in the form of dogs, coming after him, and all manner of challenges that poor man faced. But he always stood fast. He always stood strong in his faith. And because of that, he experienced the stigmata, and later on was lifted into bliss. And there's photos of him when we were in Italy in 2014. We got to visit his church where he lived the last part of his life. And there's a photo that shows him giving Mass, and he is so uplifted. He's just in ecstasy. And he was reprimanded by the church fathers because he took so long giving Mass. Well, the reason he took so long giving Mass was he was in ecstasy and completely lost track of time. There's no time in ecstasy. But that's the kind of fire that it takes to have that kind of strength to persevere to the end. What Jesus intended here is that one should rise above egocentric demands of human nature. The true disciple should empty himself and purify his heart's feelings until, like a polished chalice, he can reflect brightly in his very depths the sparkling nectar of God's grace. I wanted to read his exact words because I don't think I could say it better than he did. It's very, very moving. So that's what it means to be poor in spirit, to have that kind of humility, to be that open to the grace of God and that receptive. And the second one, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. He wasn't talking about human grief. I mean, certainly, God does give comfort to people who are grieving, but that's a transient experience. The grief is transient and the comfort is transient. But that's not the comfort that is talked about here. He's talking about the blessing that awaits every soul that longs deeply for God. So mourn here means to mourn or yearn. Yearn might even be a better word than mourn. Yearn for God's presence. Those that yearn, they shall find that divine comfort. Were the comfort impermanent that Jesus promised to those who mourn, where would be the blessedness in it? We're talking about bliss. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meek, that's a funny word. In today's language, it's kind of a colorless word. Jesus, gentle, meek, and mild. I think the man that drove the money changers out of the temple in Jerusalem was anything but meek and mild. He had incredible fire. So what does it mean, meek? And do these people ever inherit the earth if they're meek? But Swami explains that meek can be translated to mean, and there is actually another definition in the dictionary that says mild, which can also mean harmonious. So what it is meant is by meekness is to be harmonious. If we are truly in harmony with nature, with God, then we will inherit the earth. And inheriting the earth doesn't mean that little minuscule piece of property that a deceased uncle leaves us. It means we will inherit the bliss of God. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Righteousness here means righteousness in the eyes of God, not in our eyes, and not in our friends' eyes, and not the eyes of the world, but it's in the eyes of God. For before truth, opinion matters not at all. In truth, whatever is, simply is. And what other people think, or what you think, what I think, really doesn't matter. That's just an opinion. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Mercy is a quality of the heart, not of the head. It comes from empathy with others. It means the ability to broaden our realities and realize that everyone on this planet is a child of God. And regardless of what their current actions are, we must see them in that light. And if we can see them in that light and relate to them on that level, then we can truly see them as we are, children of God. And if we hold up that highest in them, in our minds about them, then we help lift them to that highest level. And that's the importance of mercy. Such awareness comes increasingly with spiritual development. For the deepest reality of all men is God's presence within. The more deeply we live centered in Him, the more clearly we discover His presence in all. Jesus said, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." And in the Greek, it's "love thy neighbor, he is like thee." But we need to take it even a step farther. Why should we love our neighbors as ourselves? Because in essence, they are ourselves. We are all one. We are all children of God. We are all essentially a manifestation of His consciousness. And there is no difference between any of us. It's just a matter of time and raising consciousness. Spiritual growth is always directional, and I think it's always helpful to keep that in mind. We'll all get there. Everyone must get there. There is no place else to go. In the end, all will find God. It might take some longer than others, but ultimately there is no other place. That is exactly why we were born. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This was always my favorite beatitude. And you hear stories like the children of Fatima and the children of Medjugorje. Why is it children that God appears to? Because they are pure in heart. Those that long for God at that early age have such pure hearts. They have no reason not to believe that God will come to them, and God does come to them. But it isn't just the children, of course. I mean, that's a quality of innocence and receptivity that they have, which makes them more receptive. But all of the saints also have seen God. Padre Pio had that experience. He saw Christ. Christ came to him many times. Sister Gyanamata had that experience. Christ came to her. More recently, I have been rereading the book by Kamala Silva, The Flawless Mirror. And if you haven't read it recently, I highly recommend the book. It's been a few years since I read it. But in that book, she talks about her own experiences after Master passed. When he appeared to her many times. Sometimes in actual vision, standing in front of her in a physical form. Sometimes it was in a conscious astral dream. but always with a special message for her. But Kamala obviously had that purity of heart so that she could see that. She could have that experience. The apostles, when Christ appeared to them transfigured, why were they able to see him? Because they were open. They were pure enough of heart. They were receptive. They were open to his grace. And because of that, they were able to see him. Purity of heart is achieved when one's feelings have been purged of all that is foreign to one's true nature, that is, our spiritual nature. Emotions and feelings that are perfectly acceptable on a lower octave, such as human love, is fine. On that level, it's appropriate and good. But on the highest level, nothing short of love for God in its purest form will give us that experience of seeing God. And that's what is meant by the purity. To the devotee who loves God for himself alone, the Lord reveals himself at last, even to his deepest, most hidden mysteries. That's what we have awaiting us. Kamala Silva also had the experience one time when Master was still in the body, and she and a group of the disciples had gone out from Mount Washington to say goodbye to a guest who was leaving. And as the guest car pulled away, they turned and looked, and Master was sitting looking out his window, from his window up on I think it's the third floor. But he was looking down at the disciples, and he spoke to one of them, and Kamala looked up at him, and then she looked away, and then she looked at him again, and she saw that his skin was blue, like Krishna. We talk about Krishna being blue, and that's the state of Christ consciousness. But I don't know that all the disciples saw Master as blue. I don't think she talked to them about what she saw, because she said in her book that she didn't reveal any of these things until she was writing the book, and she prayed to Master and asked him, is it okay if I share these things? Because Master always warned people, what God gives you as a special blessing, a special grace, keep it in your heart. Don't share it with other people. But Master told her it was okay to share, because some people need to know what these experiences are like. Maybe they're having similar experiences and they don't know if they're on the right track or not. Or maybe they don't even know what's possible. So it gives them great hope. But that was one that I don't remember hearing before, that she saw Master as blue. She even stepped underneath the porch and thought about it for a while, and then she stepped back out and looked again. Yep, he was still blue. So she knew that was a special blessing, that he was allowing her to see that, because it gave her great hope, and it opened her heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Now, peacemaking, what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean necessarily being the diplomat who mediates arguments between people, although that certainly could be a peacemaker. But to be a peacemaker means to live in that state of peace that passeth all understanding. And when we are able to live in that state, we will emanate peace to all of those around us, and their hearts will be touched. So it's not in the negative sense, which is fine on that level, to mediate troubles between people, but it's actually the higher state of consciousness in which peace is a natural quality of the divine that we begin to emanate. Peacemaking in this divine sense refers not to occasional deeds in the name of peace. Peacemaking is a constant conscious emanation of inner peace toward the world around one. I remember back in 1969 when I met Swami Kriyananda for the first time, I had been praying very deeply to Christ to show me, give me a teacher. I had been to many churches and talked with many ministers and priests and trying to find answers that I wasn't finding in my own church. I wanted somebody to tell me not how to do this on Sunday morning and then go home and live your life the way habit dictates the rest of your week. I wanted to know, how do you change your consciousness? I didn't have that terminology then, but that was what I was looking for. And I prayed very deeply to Christ. And within a week, there was an ad on the radio, happened to be KZAP, for those of you who are old enough to remember KZAP, a rock station. And there was an ad that said that there was this man who was, a Swami, was going to be giving this introductory talk, that talk was free, and then he would be offering classes after that in yoga postures and meditation. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know what yoga was all about. I hadn't studied anything about yoga, so I wasn't sure. Meditation was always intriguing. I knew that Zen Buddhists did it, and I always thought that was kind of an attractive thought, but I didn't really feel drawn to the Buddhist approach. So I went to hear Swami Kriyananda. And I have to say, that very night, when he started talking about the qualities that one can develop, he talked about divine joy, he talked about divine peace, but he didn't just talk about it. He literally was emanating it throughout the room. And I knew, I was only 19 at the time, so I knew when I was mature enough that this was the path for me and this was the teacher for me, and I never wavered from that. And it was because he didn't just talk about these things, he was living it. And he was living it on such a level that you could feel it palpably in the room. Now, I don't know if everyone else felt it, what I felt or not. That didn't matter to me, but I knew that whatever he had, I wanted. And I wanted to learn how he got it so that I could have it too. And I've never regretted that. But that's the level of peace that we're talking about in being a peacemaker. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Many of the saints have been martyred. Christian saints, other saints as well. Joan of Arc was one, notoriously. St. Paul was beheaded by the then head of Rome. In fact, I came across a legend in preparing for this talk I'd never heard before, but the legend is that St. Paul, when he was beheaded, his head bounced 3 times. Everywhere his head hit the ground, a fountain came. Now, I don't know if that's true, but, I could understand why that would be. He certainly was a great saint. And St. Peter, when he followed Paul and came to Rome, and they caught up with him and decided to crucify him, he refused to be crucified the way Christ was, because he said he wasn't worthy of that. So he was crucified upside down, which must not have been a lot of fun. But it isn't that the persecution is not what we're really interested in. It is being at the level of consciousness that it doesn't matter what God brings us, that we can stand fast and firm in our faith, and the persecution becomes irrelevant. And that's a level of consciousness that we can all aspire to. And in fact, Yogananda said that saints that were martyred in the moment of their persecution, they feel no pain because they are living in a state of grace. And so we think, poor St. Peter standing on his head for hours till he dehydrated and whatever. But in fact, he probably wasn't feeling any pain because he had that grace from Christ, and so he was not in a state of agony. Christ himself, I don't believe, was in a state of agony. He was in a state of grace. Not that crucifixion would be fun by any state of the imagination, but it's, he was lifted out of that, which is why he could say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It would be pretty hard for most people if they were hanging on a cross to say, God forgive them, they don't know what they do. So that was the state of grace that Christ was in. He had that state of blessedness, so that persecution was irrelevant. And so that is the focus. And when we can be in that state of consciousness, well, it doesn't matter what test God brings us, that we are able to stand strong in our faith and feel that bliss no matter what comes. Swamiji in his writings writes he does sort of a recap of the Beatitudes in words that are perhaps more understandable today. He says, renounce the ego. He said, this is what Christ was urging. Renounce the ego, he urged his followers, including all those today who would follow him to the heights of perfection. Yearn for the Lord from the very depths of your soul. Attune yourselves sensitively to divine truth. Never attempt vaingloriously to reshape the world in your own image or according to your own desires. Anybody ever do that? Live always by the highest principle. Follow the pathway to truth. Spurn the fascinations of delusion. Expand your heart's feelings that you include in your compassion the well-being of all earthly brothers and sisters. Purify your hearts. Be totally open to God's will and to his love. Remain inwardly unaffected by the storms of life. Seek always with inner calmness to bring divine peace on earth. In the face of death itself, finally, stand courageously by your eternal commitment to God alone. Well stated, I think. Very, very inspiring. And in the Bhagavad Gita passage for this week, all creatures live influenced by the qualities of nature. Even the wise behave in accordance with nature as it is manifested in them. Of what avail, then, is suppression? So does that mean that even the saints are locked into being affected by their lower natures? I don't think that's what is being stated here. I think the Gita is giving us hope that even great saints who have overcome, all had to overcome their lower natures. And so it gives us hope of what can be done and what awaits us. Attachment and repulsion to sense objects, both these are universally rooted. No one should accept their influence, for verily they are man's enemies. And the Gita is urging us not to succumb to our lower natures, but also always hold up for ourselves the highest that we can achieve. Because ultimately, it is our birthright. We have to find that experience where we become one with the divine. It's the reason we were born, and we have been very blessed to be part of a path where we have been given the techniques that show us how to get there. And it's one step at a time. It's one meditation at a time. It's one kriya at a time. And gradually we change and move and evolve until we have the states that are described here, and we are able to experience at last our true reality, which is that we are children of God and that we are one with the divine. God bless you.